Okay, this is going to be Revolutionary War, Part 1. As I said, we're going to start with an extended comparison. This will take 2, maybe 3 of these videos to get it done, but by the time we're done with the comparisons, you'll have a pretty good idea of how this whole thing went down. I probably won't do a play-by-play of the war as part of this, but last spring in our interdisciplinary conference, I did a session of about an hour, which I called a rapid romp through the Revolutionary War. That was not recorded at the time, but I probably will recapitulate that and make that available. I might have to figure out some things about some maps. Okay, we're going to compare the two sides. First of all, some things that are easily comparable because they can be counted or at least estimated at. Considering the colonies as one country and Britain as another, compare them in terms of populations, financial strength, industrial strength, armies, and navies. And as I said, as you'll see, we're very, very badly overmatched in all of these categories. So we may not have known how bad it was. Okay, 5 things to begin with. Populations, and this isn't armies, this is everybody, old and young, male and female. Those who supported the war, those who didn't care, and those who might have been against it on both sides. The population of Britain was at least 3, maybe 4 times that of the colonies combined. Okay? Now, nobody was counting the people, so all we got are estimates. So Britain had, I've seen estimates ranging from about 9 million people to about 11 or 12 million people at that time. That's going to be like a third as many people as Texas has now. Populations have increased dramatically in the last quarter of a millennium. Okay? The colony's population is a moving target because it was doubling about every 25 years from early colonial times all the way into the 19th century. Glad we slowed down on that. But it could have been 2.5 to 3 million people or a little over. The first time we actually had a census and counted the people was 1790, a little over a decade after the war ended, and there were 3.9 million people at that time. Okay. So Britain has much deeper manpower reserves, that sort of thing. Populations, next. Finances, wars cost money. They're lavishly expensive. And wealthier nations have more staying power than poor nations do. So here, this should have killed us by itself. Britain had a very stable currency based on a silver coin known as a pound sterling. They had other denominations of currency, but it was mainly that. They had no concept of paper money, so it's all hard, real money. And their system was working so well that they could go years and years and years without noticeable inflation. That's good. They had a powerful banking system anchored on the Bank of England, an institution already nearly 100 years old. So their banking system was very advanced. They had an amazingly modern system of financing their national debt. I forget what they called it, but they were doing a very, very good job on that. That gave them very deep reserves of credit. So they've got all that going on. We're sitting over here using pieces of paper as money. Pieces of paper that might or might not actually be redeemable for silver coinage someday. We had no banks of the modern type. So, back to Britain for a minute. There are all these big wars in the 17th and 18th centuries into the 19th in Europe, and they cost so much money. Money could be as big a factor as a military. It could be a bigger one. So one way I put it is, those wars in Europe are like a couple of guys wrestling at the bottom of a full swimming pool, and whoever has to come up for air first loses. The Brits could, and this is all metaphorical, the Brits could stay at the bottom of the pool longer than anybody. So we should have no chance. There were Dutch bankers who were always willing to bet on us. What they're thinking, I don't know. But even when the war is over and we still owe the money and don't even have the money to pay the interest, they'd be willing to roll the interest into the principal and carry us another year. So that was about it. Okay, so we've seen populations, we've seen finances, industrial strength. You may have heard of something known as the Industrial Revolution. Where did it start and when? Well, Britain in the 1760s, roughly about that decade. So it's a new thing, and the only thing coming out of their first factories was woolen cloth, but it generates large amounts of money that can be taxed and borrowed, and that figures in. So the British were already leading the world into the Industrial Revolution, while at the same time we were pre-industrial. We had iron foundries. The only heavy industry that Britain had actually encouraged in the colonies was shipbuilding. So they've got it all over us there. They could produce large quantities of firearms, cannons, gunpowder. We couldn't even produce gunpowder. It'd be a short war. Didn't solve that by capturing quite a bit. Uniforms, all the stuff you need to make war. They weren't dependent on anybody for that, and we were. So their industrial strength is much greater than ours. Now, it's tempting to say that wars between industrial powers and non-industrial countries tend to be short. Not necessarily true anymore, and it wasn't really then, because there's always some industrial power that has an interest in supporting the non-industrial power, so that allows them to hang around, and there's some other things that help too. Armies. This one's pretty hard. They got one. We don't. Britain had a lengthy and illustrious military tradition. They usually won. This may be a little bit slippery, but normally the British Army would be bigger than the ones that were better and better than the ones that were bigger. The most feared soldiers of all of Europe were from certain German states, like one called Prussia. That's in what's now northern Germany. Germany was a whole bunch of different mutually independent little states at the time, nominally united, but not effectively so. The Prussians were known for their discipline and their cruelty. There just weren't that many of them. On the other hand, France had 2.5 times as many people as Britain did, and despite the fact that respect for France's military stature today is not that good, this may surprise a lot of people. Just as English is the language of aviation, Italian is the language of music, French is the language of philosophy, German is the language of physics, French is the language of military science, because they were the first ones to approach that in a systematic way. So, the French army was always larger than the British army, but they didn't usually come out that well fighting against the British. So the British have an army. There's a catch on this a little bit. After the war ended back in 1763, the British government is strapped for cash, and they had cut corners. For a decade or more, when our Revolutionary War broke out, they'd been asking their military to do more with less. It's an expanded, far-flung empire, not as big as it would get later, that they're trying to protect and keep tabs on, and yet they've cut their army back to just the bare bones. They could fight one war in one place at one time, and I'm going to tell you this again in another connection here in a few minutes. You know what, I'm going to save it for then. But they have a disciplined army. They have drill instructors who can turn raw recruits into British regulars in a month or so. They have officers at all ranks that are well trained. They have generals who've commanded large armies. We got none of that. What we start out with are militia. These are amateur citizen soldiers who have only a vague notion of training or discipline or anything like that. They're just a bunch of farm boys. They're okay out there in the summertime while the weather's good. When it gets cold, they might kind of get the gonzies. A lot of units elected their officers and would vote them out if unpopular orders were given. So it's going to take some time and some patience to whip these guys into an army that could be called an army. And early in the war, this is after George Washington has taken command, they would sign up for 1 year. They would enlist for 1 year, and that would expire on December the 31st. And for the first probably at least 3 Decembers of the war, started in 1775, Washington is just almost at wit's end to find a way to persuade as many as possible of his men to re-up for another year. Because all too frequently it's, well, I've done my duty and let's somebody else's turn out here. So your people, you kind of start getting them trained a little bit. They shoulder the irreplaceable musket they've been issued and head home. And new, fresh, raw militia recruits show up. You got to start all over again. Washington called it changing out the army in the face of the enemy. So this is bad. Now, this is dynamic. It's going to change as the war went on. By modern estimates, at least 100,000 and maybe as many as 200,000 men bore arms on the American side. If they're all in one place at one time, that would be an immense army by 18th century standards. And by 1778, there are American regulars. Okay, by the time it's over, our army does get strong enough that it can face the British on an equal basis on the battlefield. Not on numerically, but in terms of training and discipline. So that gets better as time goes by. So at the start, we're heavily outmatched. Finally, navies. We only had a little pretense of a navy. We had a navy that we called a navy. It wasn't a powerful navy. The only actual warships we had might have been just one that the French gave us when they joined our side, and I've always suspected they gave it to us because they were afraid to go out in the deep water in it anymore. Okay, it won a battle by capturing the enemy ship. They tied them together and fought it out. That was about 1780. The British Navy was, even in a debilitated condition, the most powerful fleet afloat. The British policy for 2 centuries was to keep their navy strong enough to defeat the second and third most powerful navies in the world combined at any time. Now, they're not up to that when our Revolutionary War broke out because they've cut the budget. They have not kept up with new construction. They've not kept up with maintenance. No more than half of the ships in their fleet could put to sea when the war started, either because there hadn't been money to keep them repaired up to standards, or there weren't enough sailors to man them at wartime strength. Now they can fix that, and they did, but again, we have no formal navy to put up against them. Now here there is something I'll call it a wild card. The word privateers will appear on your screen. These would be privately owned vessels, which under international law at that time, governments formally at war could license private ship owners to arm their vessels and sent them out to practice piracy, legal piracy against enemy shipping. Okay. That has not been the case in over a century and a half now, but they're called privateers. Privateering was very dangerous, but the money. Americans might be more or less patriotic at any given time, but they're going to be where the money is. And privateering, it could be fabulously remunerative if you have a successful run. Like if you capture an enemy merchant ship and you don't tangle with their navy, the British Navy shows up, you're out of there if you can outrun them. But you're said to take a prize. You put a prize crew aboard, you sail it to a neutral or friendly port, you go through a legal procedure called condemnation, and then you sell it. Sell the ship, sell the cargo, keep the money. The owner or owners of the privateer would get half, the captain would get a quarter, the humblest deck swabber could come out independently wealthy in a run like that. So that's a wild card. Now, that doesn't take on the British Navy, but by the end of the war, there's like 700 or 800 American privateers on the North Atlantic, severely complicating British problems of reinforcement, supply, and communication. I'll cut it off here.